Hello, my fellow sleepers, and welcome back to Boring Sleepy History. So glad you could join me tonight for another little journey through time. Settle in, my friends, get comfy, find your most delicious blanket, maybe a warm cuppa, and let the gentle hum of history lull you into a peaceful slumber, or at least a wonderfully relaxed state. Where are you listening from tonight? By the firelight, maybe? Or tucked away in bed? Wherever you are, I hope you're feeling cozy and content. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy these sleepy tales. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to bring you more wonderfully dull historical facts in the future. Now, imagine this. The year is 1200 BC. You wake with a gasp, disoriented, the rough-hewn timbers of a small roundhouse pressing in around you. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and something earthy, emmer wheat perhaps? You don't understand the guttural language of the people surrounding you, but one wizened elder gestures towards a heavy gray stone and a pile of golden grains. A simple task is set before you, a task that seems deceptively easy at first. Grind this wheat, the elder seems to say. Grind enough for the day. But oh, my dears, this is where the quiet reality of the Bronze Age begins to bite. You have no idea just how achingly, bone-deep difficult this task will actually be. Let's delve into the surprisingly grueling world of Bronze Age agriculture. Stone, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was broken. A sharp, high-pitched cry sliced through the night, a sound both unfamiliar and unsettling. It jolted me from the exhausted stupor that had begun to claim me, a wave of anxious curiosity washing over the bone-deep weariness. The cry was unlike anything I'd heard before. Not the comforting crackle of the fire, not the low murmur of the wind through the thatch, not even the rustling of unseen creatures in the darkness beyond the roundhouse. This was something different. Something sharp and piercing, laced with an undercurrent of distress. My hands, blistered and aching, paused mid-grind. The quern stood silent, its heavy weight suddenly oppressive, a physical manifestation of the heavy unease settling in my chest. The air, once thick with the comforting scent of wood smoke and slowly sweetening grain, now felt thin and brittle, charged with a nervous energy. I strained my ears, listening intently, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of my own heart, a counterpoint to the absolute stillness that followed the cry. Had it been an animal? A bird, perhaps, caught in a snare? Or something else? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a cold prickle against the warmth of the fire's glow. The roundhouse, which had felt like a safe haven just moments before, now seemed to shrink, its protective walls feeling flimsy and inadequate against whatever lurked in the darkness beyond. I glanced towards the fire, its flames dancing and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. The familiar comfort it had provided only moments ago felt diminished, replaced by a feeling of vulnerability. The warmth still soothed the aching muscles in my arms and shoulders, but it did little to quell the growing unease in my heart. Slowly, cautiously, I rose from my task, the sudden movement sending a wave of dizziness through me. My legs trembled with exhaustion, but the need to know, to understand the source of that chilling cry, pushed me forward. I approached the small, smoke-stained opening that served as the roundhouse's only entrance, peering out into the night. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable. Only the faintest glimmers of starlight pierced the thick canopy above. The sounds of the settlement were muted, almost absent. The usual gentle hum of nocturnal activity replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the sporadic crackle of the fire behind me. My breath hitched in my throat. The cry hadn't been repeated. Was it a warning? A plea for help? Or just a fleeting sound of the night misinterpreted by my exhausted mind? The weight of the quern, the unending rhythm of its grind, the relentless demands of my task, all these faded into the background, overshadowed by the unknown that lay just beyond the reach of the firelight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing down upon me. The night pulsed with an unseen energy, with an unspoken anxiety that mirrored the turmoil within my own heart. I turned back to the quern, its still form a reassuring presence in the growing uncertainty, yet the image of the night and the unanswered cry remained etched sharply into my mind. My own heartbeat was abruptly silenced. A sharp, insistent rapping echoed from the heavy wooden door of the roundhouse, shattering the quietude that had settled over the space like a thick woolen blanket. My muscles, already screaming in protest from hours of relentless grinding, tensed further, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my weary frame. The steady, comforting crackle of the fire seemed to shrink, its warmth momentarily eclipsed by a wave of apprehension. For a long moment I remained frozen, the wooden handle of the quern still clutched in my numb fingers. The rapping continued, more insistent now, a staccato rhythm against the hushed breathing of the night. It wasn't the soft scratching of a small animal, nor the rustling of leaves in the wind. This was deliberate, purposeful, a summons. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a stark contrast to the slow, deliberate grind of the quern that had dominated my world for what felt like an eternity. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth, usually comforting, now felt heavy, suffocating. The rough texture of the wool against my skin, once a source of dull comfort, suddenly felt irritating, a constant reminder of my physical exhaustion. Even the comforting warmth of the fire felt less soothing, more like a cage, trapping me within the confines of the roundhouse. The firelight flickered and danced, casting elongated shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, mirroring the turmoil within me. A wave of nausea rolled over me. The hours spent hunched over the quern, the monotonous rhythm, the bone-deep weariness, it all threatened to overwhelm me. I felt a desperate longing for the familiar comfort of my past life, a life that now seemed a distant, hazy dream. Yet there was also a flicker of something else, curiosity, a cautious, fearful curiosity that battled with the overwhelming exhaustion. What lay beyond the door? Who was seeking me out in the dead of night? With a groan, I set down the heavy quern handle. My hands, raw and blistered, felt strangely light, as if they were no longer my own. I rose slowly, my joints protesting with every movement. Each step towards the door felt like an age, my muscles aching, my head swimming. The firelight seemed to cling to me as if reluctant to let me go into the unknown. I reached for a crudely fashioned wooden bowl, still filled with the pale, powdery flour, its subtle scent a final reminder of my arduous task. My hand trembled as I reached for the heavy latch. a deep breath, a moment of silent prayer. Perhaps a foolish act, but it brought a flicker of courage. I pushed the door open a crack, a sliver of darkness framed by the rough-hewn wood. The rapping ceased, replaced by a hushed whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. A voice, barely audible, spoke my name. Or rather, it spoke the word that, in this strange new world, now served as my name: Grinder. Gentle wisdom in his voice. The rhythmic rasp of the quern, the steady companion of the last hours, was suddenly overwhelmed. A shudder ran through the roundhouse, not the subtle tremor of shifting earth, but a violent, insistent shaking. The thatch roof above groaned, a low, ominous sigh that sent a jolt of icy fear through me. The fire, my steadfast ally against the encroaching cold, bucked and spat, sending a shower of bright sparks dancing across the earthen floor. One landed dangerously close to the pile of slowly accumulating flour, a tiny fiery ember threatening to consume the fruits of my long labor. My hands, already raw and blistered, instinctively tightened their grip on the quern's handle. The grinding stopped, the silence that followed amplifying the howling wind that battered the outside walls. It was a sound of raw, untamed power, a force far greater than anything I'd encountered in this strange, isolated world. Panic, sharp and immediate, clawed at my throat. This wasn't just a storm. This felt like an assault, a furious attack on the fragile sanctuary I'd found. I fought down the rising tide of fear, forcing myself to assess the situation. The roundhouse itself, a seemingly solid structure, now felt precarious, vulnerable. Each gust of wind seemed to test its limits, a series of brutal blows that threatened to tear the thatch apart. The wooden frame groaned under the strain, its creaks and groans echoing the turmoil in my own chest. I strained to see through the flickering firelight, searching for signs of damage. The shadows danced and writhed, exaggerating every crack and crevice in the walls. The smell of wood smoke, usually comforting, now carried a note of acrid danger. The air itself seemed thick with tension, the silence between the wind's roars heavy with anticipation. My muscles, already aching from hours of grinding, tensed further, bracing themselves against the unpredictable violence of the storm. I tried to focus on the practical, to find a solution, but the primal fear lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. Slowly, cautiously, I examined the structure. The thatch, while clearly battered, held firm. The wooden frame, despite its groaning protest, seemed sturdy enough. There were no gaping holes, no obvious signs of imminent collapse. Relief, tentative and fragile, began to replace the overwhelming terror. The fire, too, had settled, its flames licking at the wood with a less frenzied intensity. With the immediate threat seeming to subside somewhat, a different kind of exhaustion settled over me, one born of a different type of fear. It was the dull ache of sustained tension, the weariness that comes from facing down an unseen adversary. My mind, normally focused on the rhythmic motions of the quern, now raced with images of the storm's fury. The wind's power, a stark reminder of my own vulnerability in this strange land. The weight of the pot of flour seemed heavier, a symbol of my resilience against the forces of nature. The rhythmic crackling of the fire returned as my most steadfast companion, the reassuring heartbeat of my sheltered world. The storm continued its assault, but now, armed with a renewed resolve born of survival, I felt a quiet confidence growing within me. I was ready to face whatever the night held. The rhythmic rasp of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, faltered. My aching arms, usually numb with the monotony of the task, felt the sudden slackening as if protesting against the interruption. My gaze, usually fixed on the slow, steady turning of the stones, drifted. It was the flicker of movement by the fire that caught my eye, a fleeting shadow against the dancing flames. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the embers playing games with my weary vision. But the movement persisted, a tiny, frantic fluttering. I leaned closer, the heat of the fire warming my chilled skin, and saw it. A small creature, no bigger than my hand, huddled near the flames. It was a bird, I think, its feathers ruffled and dull, one wing drooping limply. It chirped weakly, a thin, reedy sound that cut through the usual quiet of the roundhouse. A strange feeling washed over me, a tide of something unexpected and unfamiliar. It wasn't the usual weariness or the dull ache in my muscles. This was empathy, a wave of compassion so intense it almost surprised me. Here I was, struggling with a seemingly endless task, utterly alone and adrift in this strange, ancient world, yet I found myself caring for this tiny, injured thing. I carefully reached for a piece of soft, discarded wool, pulling it from the pile next to the quern. My hands, rough and blistered from hours of grinding, moved with unexpected gentleness as I approached the bird. It trembled, its tiny body quivering with fear and exhaustion. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, unsure if I even could help. But the sight of its injured wing, its desperate chirps, compelled me. Slowly, gently, I scooped it up in my palm. Its small body felt fragile, almost weightless. The wool felt rough against its feathers, yet I didn't dare to be more gentle. The warmth of my hand seemed to comfort it, and the frantic fluttering subsided into a hesitant stillness. I cradled it close, its small heart beating rapidly against my skin. The rhythmic grinding of the quern was forgotten, replaced by the soft, uneven pulse of the tiny creature in my hand. I brought the bird closer to the fire, careful to keep it at a safe distance from the flames. The warmth seemed to soothe it, its tiny body relaxing slightly. I sat there for a long time, the quern still and silent, holding the bird close, letting the warmth of the fire and the unexpected tenderness in my heart chase away the shadows of weariness. The rhythm of the quern's silence felt strangely comforting, a break from the unending grind, a chance to connect with something beyond the relentless task. The bird's small weight in my hand became a symbol of the fragile beauty that still existed in this raw, harsh world. And as I sat there, the first rays of dawn painting the thatch roof a soft, ethereal gold, a faint sense of hope, as fragile as the bird in my hand, began to bloom in my weary heart. The warmth of the fire, a constant companion throughout this long night, began to weave its spell. The rhythmic grinding of the quern, once a source of strain, had become a hypnotic drone, a low hum that vibrated through my bones. My muscles, screaming in protest just hours ago, now ached with a dull, persistent throb that felt almost comforting. The steady pulse of the quern and the crackling fire combined to lull me into a state that hovered between wakefulness and sleep. I wasn't truly asleep, not entirely, but neither was I fully present. My mind drifted, slipping in and out of a hazy half-consciousness. And then the dreams began. They weren't pleasant dreams, not in the way dreams often are. These were fragments, glimpses, flashes of a life that felt both utterly familiar and impossibly distant. Faces swam before my eyes, faces of people I couldn't quite place, loved ones perhaps, friends, family. But their features blurred, shifting like reflections in a disturbed pool. Sometimes a face would resolve, momentarily sharp and clear, only to dissolve back into the indistinct fog of memory the next instant. I saw glimpses of places, bright, bustling streets, sun-drenched fields, the cool interior of a stone building that might have been a church, or perhaps a schoolhouse. These images lacked detail. They were more impressions than photographs. A sense of warmth, of laughter, of belonging, fleeting sensations that disappeared as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind only a hollowness, a nagging sense of loss. One dream was particularly vivid, a recurring motif. I was sitting in a room bathed in sunlight. Through a large window, I could see a garden overflowing with vibrant flowers and the green canopy of trees. I could almost smell the scent of roses and damp earth. The room itself was comfortable, warm, and inviting. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't quite reach it, couldn't quite grasp the details. Every time I tried to step forward, to touch the soft petals of a rose, or feel the cool smoothness of the window pane, the scene would fade, leaving me adrift once more in the dim light of the roundhouse. Other dreams were darker, filled with shadows and indistinct shapes. The feelings associated with these dreams were stronger, more visceral than the fleeting memories of the sun-drenched garden. A pervasive sense of unease, anxiety, even fear pulsed through these nightmarish fragments. There were sounds, too, distant voices calling my name, a cacophony of sounds that melded and shifted, refusing to coalesce into anything comprehensible. Each time I drifted back to consciousness, the firelight would briefly pierce the fog. The rhythmic grinding of the quern, a grounding anchor pulling me back to the present moment. The smell of the grain, the rough feel of the quern handle against my blistered hands, the warmth of the fire on my skin, all served as anchors, reassuring reminders of where I was, of the task that still lay unfinished. But the echoes of those dreams lingered, like the faint scent of wood smoke on a cold morning. They were a constant reminder of what I'd left behind, of a life I barely recognized anymore. And yet, strangely, they also provided a strange, unwelcome comfort, confirming that there was indeed something to mourn, a history that existed beyond this harsh, unforgiving reality. The rhythmic rasp of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, continued its relentless cycle. My hands, raw and blistered, moved almost without conscious thought, guided by a rote learned in the long hours of grinding. The fire, my constant companion, crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the roundhouse walls. The familiar scent of wood smoke, thick and comforting, had been my olfactory blanket throughout the endless night. But now, a new smell, sharp and unexpected, cut through the wood smoke. It was the smell of roasting meat, rich and savory, a scent that pierced through the ingrained aroma of the grain and the damp earth. It carried on a sudden gust of wind, a breath of something different, something alive. The wind itself brought with it other sounds, faint at first, then growing stronger. The murmur of voices, the low laughter of many people, the clinking of something metallic, the sounds of a feast. My stomach rumbled, a low growl that echoed the hunger gnawing at me. Hours of grinding had left me ravenous, the emptiness a hollow ache that extended beyond physical need. It was more than hunger. It was a yearning, a primal longing for connection, for something beyond the solitary rhythm of the quern. The rhythmic turning of the stones slowed slightly. My grip on the handle loosened, a fraction at first, then more noticeably. My thoughts, previously occupied solely by the repetitive motion, now wandered. Were they celebrating? A harvest festival? A successful hunt? The possibilities swirled in my mind, sparking a flicker of cautious hope. Hope was a fragile thing, a rare butterfly in this harsh, unforgiving world. I strained to hear the voices more clearly, trying to decipher the language. It was unfamiliar, a melodic stream of sounds that was somehow both alien and strangely comforting. It spoke of community, of shared effort, of sustenance. The thought of joining them, of sharing in their meal, however briefly, was a powerful pull. Yet a lingering apprehension held me back. I was an outsider, a stranger in this strange land. My place was here, in the dim light of the roundhouse, with the heavy quern and the crackling fire. But the smell of roasting meat, tantalizingly close, beckoned. The thought of warm food, of the communal warmth that it suggested, was too strong to ignore completely. I continued to grind, the motion slower now, hesitant, the rhythm broken. My thoughts wrestled with the familiar fear of the unknown and the intense longing for connection and respite. The wind continued to parry the tantalizing scents and distant sounds, creating a powerful conflict within me. I could almost taste the succulent meat, and the thought sent a shiver of desire mixed with the growing trepidation of what to do next. The last few grains were slowly but surely being ground, the end of my task in sight. With each rotation, the images of the feast became clearer, and the hunger more intense. I imagined the warmth of the fire shared with many others, a stark contrast to the solitary warmth of this roundhouse. The sounds of merriment pulled at my spirit. Despite lingering fear, the possibility of belonging, of participation, even just for a brief moment, became a compelling force. This gnawing hunger for companionship, it seemed, was as vital as the hunger in my belly. The rhythmic rasp of the quern, my constant companion for what felt like an eternity, continued its steady song. But something was wrong. A subtle shift in the air, a change too delicate to define, yet undeniable in its presence. It was a stillness, a silence so profound it pressed against my ears, a heavy blanket stifling the usual hum of the settlement. The crackling fire, usually a comforting counterpoint to the quern's grind, had dwindled to a faint whisper, the embers glowing with an unsettling dimness. My breath, ragged and shallow from hours of relentless work, was the only sound now. The usual sounds of life, the distant murmur of voices, the occasional cry of a child, the rhythmic thud of some unseen task, were gone, replaced by an unnerving, absolute quiet. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a deep sleep. This was a silence pregnant with unspoken dread, a vacuum where the sounds of life should have been. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache in my muscles. My heart, already weary from the physical exertion, pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I paused my work, the rough wooden handle of the quern resting heavy in my calloused hands. The flour, a pale dusting on the worn stone, seemed to mock my stillness. Slowly, cautiously, I rose, my limbs stiff and protesting. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. I approached the entrance to the roundhouse, my hand trembling as I pushed aside the rough-hewn door. The night air was heavy and still, lacking the usual gentle breezes that stirred the leaves of the nearby trees.
The sky, visible through the gaps in the thatch of the neighboring huts, was a thick, inky black, devoid of stars. An unnatural stillness hung in the air, a suffocating silence that swallowed even the chirping of crickets. I peered into the darkness beyond my immediate circle of firelight. The familiar shapes of the other roundhouses were only dimly visible, and the outlines of their inhabitants, normally warm and glowing with the reflected light from their own hearths, were absent. A chilling certainty settled over me. This wasn't a temporary quiet. It was a cessation, a complete and sudden halting of the life that had surrounded me just moments before. The rhythmic pulse of the settlement had stopped. The unseen creatures that usually serenaded the night with their calls were silent. Even the wind, that restless spirit of the plains, had ceased its whispering. A prickling sensation ran down my spine, a primal fear that transcended simple apprehension. This silence was not natural. It was a chilling, unnatural pause, a void that spoke of something terrible, something unseen, something wrong. The weight of the quiet pressed down on me, a physical burden almost as heavy as the quern I had just been turning. The smell of wood smoke, once comforting, now seemed acrid, a harbinger of something dreadful. The world outside my little circle of warmth held a silent, terrifying unknown. I stumbled back into the roundhouse, the familiar warmth of the fire offering only a feeble comfort against the spreading ice of fear that gripped my heart. The quern, once a symbol of my solitary struggle, now seemed to mock my helplessness. The rhythmic grind was replaced by the throbbing beat of terror in my ears, a rhythm far more relentless than any I'd endured before.
The rhythmic rasp of the quern, my constant companion for what felt like an eternity, continued its steady song. But something was wrong. A subtle shift in the air, a change too delicate to define, yet undeniable in its presence. It was a stillness, a silence so profound it pressed against my ears, a heavy blanket stifling the usual hum of the settlement. The crackling fire, usually a comforting counterpoint to the quern's grind, had dwindled to a faint whisper, the embers glowing with an unsettling dimness. My breath, ragged and shallow from hours of relentless work, was the only sound now. The usual sounds of life, the distant murmur of voices, the occasional cry of a child, the rhythmic thud of some unseen task, were gone, replaced by an unnerving, absolute quiet. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a deep sleep. This was a silence pregnant with unspoken dread, a vacuum where the sounds of life should have been. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache in my muscles. My heart, already weary from the physical exertion, pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I paused my work, the rough wooden handle of the quern resting heavy in my calloused hands. The flour, a pale dusting on the worn stone, seemed to mock my stillness. Slowly, cautiously, I rose, my limbs stiff and protesting. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. I approached the entrance to the roundhouse, my hand trembling as I pushed aside the rough-hewn door. The night air was heavy and still, lacking the usual gentle breezes that stirred the leaves of the nearby trees. The sky, visible through the gaps in the thatch of the neighboring huts, was a thick, inky black,
devoid of stars. An unnatural stillness hung in the air, a suffocating silence that swallowed even the chirping of crickets. I peered into the darkness beyond my immediate circle of firelight. The familiar shapes of the other roundhouses were only dimly visible, and the outlines of their inhabitants, normally warm and glowing with the reflected light from their own hearths, were absent. A chilling certainty settled over me. This wasn't a temporary quiet. It was a cessation, a complete and sudden halting of the life that had surrounded me just moments before. The rhythmic pulse of the settlement had stopped. The unseen creatures that usually serenaded the night with their calls were silent. Even the wind, that restless spirit of the plains, had ceased its whispering. A prickling sensation ran down my spine, a primal fear that transcends simple apprehension. This silence was not natural. It was a chilling, unnatural pause, a void that spoke of something terrible, something unseen, something wrong. The weight of the quiet pressed down on me, a physical burden almost as heavy as the quern I had just been turning. The smell of wood smoke, once comforting, now seemed acrid, a harbinger of something dreadful. The world outside my little circle of warmth held a silent, terrifying unknown. I stumbled back into the roundhouse, the familiar warmth of the fire offering only a feeble comfort against the spreading ice of fear that gripped my heart. The quern, once a symbol of my solitary struggle, now seemed to mock my helplessness. The rhythmic grind was replaced by the throbbing beat of terror in my ears, a rhythm far more relentless than any I'd endured before.
The rhythmic rasp of the quern, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my existence, was abruptly shattered. The earth lurched beneath me, a violent shudder that sent the roundhouse swaying. I gripped the wooden handle of the quern, my knuckles white, my heart leaping into my throat. The fire, usually a comforting presence, danced wildly, casting flickering shadows that writhed like phantoms on the earthen walls. The tremor intensified, a deep, guttural groan that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. Then, silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that followed the violent upheaval. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart, a drumbeat against the sudden stillness. Slowly, cautiously, I released my grip on the quern, my body trembling. I looked down, and a wave of despair washed over me. The clay pot, my hard-earned prize, lay shattered on the floor. Its precious contents, the finely ground flour, scattered like pale dust across the packed earth. Hours of relentless work, of aching muscles and blistered hands, reduced to this. The effort, the rhythm, the slow, meditative process, all undone. A bitter taste rose in my mouth, a mixture of grit and unshed tears. The fire, now calmed, cast a weak, hesitant light on the mess, highlighting the fragility of my accomplishment. I felt a deep sense of failure, a crushing weight of inadequacy. Had I not ground the grain finely enough? Had I not placed the pot securely enough? Had some unseen force, greater than myself, decided my efforts were for naught? I sat there for a long time, the silence pressing down on me, the smell of spilled flour mingling with the ever-present wood smoke. The darkness outside seemed deeper, more menacing than before. The tremor had shaken not just the roundhouse, but also my confidence, my nascent sense of belonging. The world I had begun to accept, to find a rhythm within, felt suddenly unstable, unpredictable. But slowly,
As the initial shock subsided, a different feeling began to creep in. It was not hope, not yet, but a grudging acceptance. The tremor, the spilled flour, it was just another event in this strange new life, another obstacle to overcome. I looked at the scattered flour, the pale dust on the floor, and a spark of determination flickered within me. It was a small spark, fragile as the flames dancing in the hearth, but it was there. I felt a deep sense of failure, a crushing weight of inadequacy. Had I not ground the grain finely enough? Had I not placed the pot securely enough? Had some unseen force greater than myself decided my efforts were for naught? I sat there for a long time, the silence pressing down on me, the smell of spilled flour mingling with the ever-present wood smoke. The darkness outside seemed deeper, more menacing than before. The tremor had shaken not just the roundhouse, but also my confidence, my nascent sense of belonging. The world I had begun to accept, to find a rhythm within, felt suddenly unstable, unpredictable. But slowly, as the initial shock subsided, a different feeling began to creep in. It was not hope, not yet, but a grudging acceptance. The tremor, the spilled flour, it was just another event in this strange new life, another obstacle to overcome. I looked at the scattered flour, the pale dust on the floor, and a spark of determination flickered within me. It was a small spark, fragile as the flames dancing in the hearth, but it was there. I began to gather the flour, my fingers brushing against the cold earth, feeling the rough texture of the ground beneath my calloused hands. It was slow work, painstaking and humbling, but with each handful of flour I retrieved, my spirit lifted a little. The spilled grain was not a defeat, but a challenge. And in the face of this challenge, I felt a quiet resolve. I would grind again. I would fill the pot once more. This earth might shake, but my spirit would endure. The rhythm, though interrupted, would continue.
The rhythmic rasp of the quern had faded into a low hum, a counterpoint to the crackling fire. My muscles, once screaming in protest, now ached with a dull, persistent throb. The flour, a pale, creamy mound in its earthen pot, testified to hours of relentless work. But a new sound had insinuated itself into the night, a sound at first too subtle to register, then slowly growing, persistent and insistent, like the drip, drip, drip of water. It came from the roof, a steady, rhythmic dripping that echoed in the close confines of the roundhouse. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the ears, a phantom sound born of exhaustion. But the dripping continued, unwavering, each drop a tiny hammer against the silence. My gaze drifted upwards, towards the thatch, a thick, uneven layer obscuring the night sky. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that distorted the familiar shapes, making the familiar feel strangely unfamiliar. A prickle of unease settled in my stomach. The rain was coming, I knew it. The air held a dampness that spoke of approaching storms, a chill that seeped into the very bones. The dripping wasn't just annoying, it was a warning. It spoke of a weakness in the structure, a vulnerability that could easily become a disaster. My work, my hours of effort, all of it stood poised on the edge of ruin. The thought sent a fresh wave of exhaustion through me, but also a surge of purpose. I couldn't afford to simply ignore the problem. The roundhouse was my shelter, my sanctuary, my fragile defense against the elements. Leaving it exposed to the storm was unthinkable. I rose slowly, stiff and weary, the movement sending a fresh jolt of pain through my arms and back. I cautiously approached the source of the dripping, the firelight casting long, wavering shadows that danced like frightened spirits on the walls. The dripping seemed to be concentrated in one area, near the corner where the thatch sagged slightly. I reached up, cautiously feeling the thatch. It was damp, sodden in places, and surprisingly weak. Small holes could be felt, gaps where rain would surely find its way. My fingers found a small, loose piece of thatch, easily pulled away, revealing a gap large enough for my hand to slip through. Below, the earthen walls seemed dry, but the wood supporting the roof above was clearly waterlogged in parts. The weight of the thatch was too much for the damaged supporting structure. The repair wouldn't be easy. I spent the next hour carefully examining the damage, my initial worry growing into a grim determination. The rain was drawing closer, its approach heralded by a shift in the wind, a gust that sent a flurry of sparks from the fire, a further reminder of my precarious position. I needed to find some kind of solution before the rain arrived. Outside the roundhouse, I found some sturdy branches, strong enough to brace the thatch. Using the meager tools available to me, I began the slow, painstaking work of shoring up the damaged area, the work demanding more strength than I had remaining. The dripping continued, a constant, relentless soundtrack to my efforts. Each piece of thatch secured brought a small surge of relief and a sense that I might just be able to keep out the coming storm. The hours melted away. The night sky, visible through the gaps in the thatch, grew lighter, hinting at the approach of dawn. The task was immense, but the looming threat of the storm had pushed aside all weariness, replacing it with a quiet, determined resolve. The rhythmic grind of the quern, a constant companion for what felt like lifetimes, slowed. My muscles, screaming in protest, finally found a brief reprieve as I rested my hands, the rough wood of the handle a familiar comfort against my aching palms. The fire, my unwavering friend through the long night, crackled softly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the exhaustion tugging at my eyelids. Then it happened. A wave of warmth, unexpected and profound, washed over me. It wasn't the comforting heat of the fire, but something different, something softer. The air, thick with the familiar scent of wood smoke and grain, was suddenly infused with something else. A sweet, earthy fragrance, like dried herbs simmering gently. It was a fragrance both unfamiliar and strangely comforting, a hint of something beyond the rough reality of my existence. My ears, accustomed to the silence of the sleeping settlement, picked up a low murmur, a soft susurrus of voices approaching from the outside. They were close now, their hushed tones hinting at a cautious approach, a respect for the quiet solitude of the roundhouse. A feeling of anticipation, a mixture of trepidation and hope stirred within me. I'd been alone for so long, lost in the monotonous rhythm of my task, that the prospect of human contact felt almost surreal, a dreamlike intrusion into my self-imposed isolation. The murmured voices grew louder, closer, their tones suggesting a shared understanding, a silent agreement. The air thrummed with a subtle energy, the familiar weight of the night lifting slightly, replaced by a sense of gentle expectation. Then a hand, strong and sure, reached out and gently touched the side of the roundhouse. The rough-hewn wood creaked a soft greeting as the entrance flap parted slightly. A silhouette emerged, framed by the flickering firelight. The shape of a person, but their features were obscured by the shadows.
They moved with a quiet grace, a deliberate stillness that spoke of experience and knowledge. The scent of herbs intensified, a fragrant bouquet hinting at healing and soothing properties. Another figure followed, smaller, perhaps a younger apprentice or assistant. Their steps were soft, measured, careful not to disturb the stillness of the night. Slowly, hesitantly, they entered the roundhouse. Their presence brought with it not only the scent of herbs, but a palpable sense of relief, a silent assurance that I wouldn't be left alone to battle the exhaustion and the lingering fear of the unknown. I watched, lost in the warmth of the fire and the soothing fragrance as they approached. The old woman, for that's who she seemed to be, smiled. A quiet, knowing smile that spoke of years of wisdom, of countless nights spent tending to the hurts and weariness of others. There was comfort in her presence, a soft, calming strength that eased the tension in my stiff muscles and settled the unease in my heart. It felt as if the long night finally ended and a new beginning quietly dawned. My eyes began to close, weightless, sinking into the warmth and the soothing whispers of the healer. The grinding of the quern faded, replaced by the gentle rhythm of breathing and the low hum of voices, a comforting lullaby in the pre-dawn hours.
The healer's hands, rough and calloused, yet surprisingly gentle, finished their work. A small, almost imperceptible cut on my hand, barely more than a scratch, was now bandaged neatly. The old woman, for I knew no other way to think of her, smiled, a slow, subtle movement of her lips that barely altered her expression, yet somehow communicated a profound sense of peace. Then she offered me a gift. It was small, no bigger than my thumb, a wooden doll. Intricately carved, its features were simplest, almost childlike. Round eyes, a tiny upturned mouth. The wood itself felt smooth, polished by years of handling, perhaps. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, a subtle, sweet scent like dried herbs. I held it in my palm, its weight negligible, yet the sensation surprisingly comforting. Holding the doll, a wave of memories washed over me, unexpected and vivid. I saw myself, younger, much younger, playing in a field of tall grass, the sun warm on my face. I remembered a similar doll, one my mother had made for me, its paint chipped and faded now, lost somewhere in the distant past. The feelings attached to that memory, a sense of security, of love, of belonging, were surprisingly intense. It felt like holding a piece of that lost world in my hand. The healer watched me, her eyes holding a depth I hadn't noticed before. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding of loss and memory. I traced the tiny lines carved into the doll's simple dress, the grain of the wood smooth beneath my fingertips. It wasn't just a doll, it was a conduit, a connection to a life I had almost forgotten. The warmth of the firelight seemed to intensify, casting long shadows on the walls of the roundhouse. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the subtle fragrance of the doll, creating a strange, comforting aroma, a blend of the past and the present. The rhythmic crackling of the fire felt almost like a lullaby, a gentle rhythm that soothed my weary mind. The feeling of exhaustion still lingered, a heavy weight in my limbs, but it felt different now, less daunting, somehow softer. The small wooden doll, a simple gift, had somehow bridged the chasm between then and now, offering a momentary escape from the harsh reality of my present. It was a reminder of the enduring power of human connection, of simple acts of kindness,
and of the resilience of the human spirit. It was a silent promise of hope whispered in the heart of a forgotten, ancient world. Holding the doll close, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me, a calmness born not from the absence of worry, but from a renewed acceptance of my surroundings, a sense of belonging. The rhythmic grind of the quern had finally ceased, the last of the grain transformed into a coarse, creamy flour resting in its earthen pot. My muscles ached, a deep, pervasive weariness settling into my bones. Yet a strange calm had fallen over me, a quiet contentment that surprised even myself. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the roundhouse walls, a comforting counterpoint to the silence that had settled over the sleeping village. I sat there, the warmth of the fire a soothing balm against the chill of the night air that seeped through the cracks in the thatch. It was then I noticed it, a gentle rocking, a slow, subtle sway that had been present all along, unnoticed in the intensity of my work. The roundhouse, I realized, was built upon a slight slope, and the very earth beneath it seemed to breathe, a slow, almost imperceptible rise and fall. This subtle movement, like the rocking of a cradle, began to lull me. My eyelids grew heavy, my awareness drifting. The firelight flickered, its patterns blurring into an indistinct landscape. The scent of wood smoke, sharp and earthy earlier, now seemed softened, mellowed by the warmth and the impending sleep. My thoughts, normally sharp and focused, began to unravel, dissolving into a hazy stream of images and sensations. I dreamt of the sea, a vast expanse of rolling waves beneath a sky the color of pewter. The salt spray, the bitter tang of the ocean wind, memories from a life that felt both vividly real and impossibly distant, a half-remembered dream within a dream. I saw the faces of my fellow sailors, blurred and indistinct, their voices echoing faintly in the distance. The boisterous laughter, the shared anxieties, the camaraderie forged in the crucible of long voyages. The cries of gulls, sharp and piercing, cut through the haze, a haunting reminder of a life I had left behind. The rocking intensified, almost hypnotic in its regularity. The dreams became more fragmented, less coherent, a jumble of faces, places, sounds. The bakery back home, its comforting aroma of warm bread, flickered momentarily before dissolving into the rough, earthy smell of the roundhouse. The rhythmic grinding of the quern, the crackling of the fire, the cries of the gulls, all interwoven, a strange, unsettling tapestry of memory and sensation. The weight of the thatch roof above me, normally a source of slight anxiety, now felt protective, a comforting presence. Sleep, deep and dreamless, finally claimed me. The gentle sway of the roundhouse continued, its rhythmic motion a lullaby, rocking me into the quiet depths of slumber. Even in my unconsciousness, I felt a sense of acceptance, of belonging in this strange, ancient world. The sounds of the night, the whispers of the wind, the crackling fire, the distant calls of unseen creatures, all blended together into a comforting, muffled drone. The embers of the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing coals, their warmth a fading echo against the chill of the early morning. My body ached, a deep, pervasive weariness settling into my bones. The rhythmic grind of the quern, once a relentless companion, was now a distant memory, replaced by the quiet hum of exhaustion. I sat there, cradling the clay pot of flour, its weight strangely comforting in my numb hands.
The rough texture of the pot felt familiar now, a tactile anchor in the swirling uncertainty of my existence. Sleep had offered little respite, a fractured landscape of dreams and half-remembered anxieties. But the darkness had yielded, reluctantly, to the slow intrusion of dawn. A pale light, at first, seeping through the gaps in the thatch roof. Then a sudden burst of color, a vibrant splash against the muted tones of the roundhouse interior. Hesitantly, I rose, my joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and pops. I pushed aside the heavy hide that served as a door, stepping out into the burgeoning light. And there it was. A tapestry of wildflowers, a riot of color and scent spread before me like a painted dream. Their hues were unfamiliar, yet strangely compelling. A symphony of purples, oranges, and yellows I had never encountered before. The air hummed with the sweet perfume of blossoms, a heady fragrance that filled my lungs and stirred something deep within my soul. I knelt, my stiff fingers tentatively tracing the delicate petals of a flower shaped like a tiny five-pointed star. Its texture was soft, almost velvety, a stark contrast to the rough wool of my clothes and the coarse grain I had ground for so long. A low hum seemed to emanate from the field, the collective whisper of 1,000 tiny lives unfolding in the morning sun. A wave of memory crashed over me, unexpected and powerful. It wasn't just the beauty of the flowers, it was the scent, sharp and sweet, a scent that transported me back across the vast gulf of time and circumstance. I saw with startling clarity a sun-drenched meadow back home, a place I had almost forgotten, a place of carefree childhood days spent chasing butterflies and weaving flower crowns. The laughter of children, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the vibrant tapestry of wildflowers so similar to the ones before me now. It was a vision so vivid, so intense, that tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. The memory felt both precious and achingly poignant. It was a ghost of a life that felt both real and impossibly distant, a reminder of a world that seemed to exist in a different dimension now. But the present, the wildflowers unfolding before me, were real, tangible, just as the ache in my muscles and the weight of the clay pot in my hands were real. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden light over the blossoming field. The sounds of the settlement began to stir, the murmur of voices, the bleating of animals, the gentle rhythm of everyday life. But for a moment longer, I remained kneeling among the flowers, their sweet perfume a silent comfort, their vibrant colors a reminder of both the beauty of the past and the surprising resilience of the human heart. The weight of the past was still there, but it was lighter now, buoyed by the unexpected beauty of the present moment. A new day was dawning, and with it, a quiet acceptance of my place in this strange, ancient world. The rhythmic rasp of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was abruptly shattered. A sharp crack, like the snapping of a dry twig, echoed through the small roundhouse. It was followed by a silence, heavy and pregnant with foreboding, broken only by the frantic thump, thump, thump of my own heart. Then a slow, steady drip. Drip, drip, drip. My muscles, already screaming in protest after hours of relentless grinding, tensed. I slowly lowered the heavy quernstone, the familiar weight a comforting anchor in the sudden surge of anxiety. My gaze followed the sound, tracing the line of the dripping water until I located the source. A small, ragged tear in the thatch roof directly above the clay pot where I'd carefully stored my hard-earned flour. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at me. All that work, all that aching effort, threatened by a simple leak. The precious flour, the creamy, fragrant reward for hours of back-breaking labor, was in danger. The thought was almost physically painful. A fresh weight added to my already exhausted frame. The drip, drip, drip continued, each drop a tiny hammer blow against my already frayed nerves. I had to act, and quickly. But the exhaustion weighed heavily on me, a leaden cloak stifling any immediate impulse to leap to action. My hands, raw and blistered, felt clumsy and useless. The air hung thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, mingling now with the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Taking a deep breath, I carefully approached the leak, the rough texture of the packed earth floor cool beneath my bare feet. The firelight cast dancing shadows, making the tear in the thatch seem even larger, more menacing. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the brittle, decaying stalks. They crumbled at my touch, a fragile defense against the relentless advance of the night's rain. My mind raced, searching for a solution. There were no tools, no readily available materials, only the meager resources of the roundhouse itself. My gaze fell upon the discarded bundle of dried reeds near the fire. A slender hope sparked within me. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all I had. Gathering the reeds, I carefully worked them into the tear, attempting to weave them tightly enough to staunch the flow. My fingers ached, my muscles protested with every movement, but the urgency of the situation pushed me onward. The drip, drip, drip slowed, becoming a hesitant stutter, then a mere occasional trickle. Relief washed over me, a wave of exhaustion mixed with a fragile sense of accomplishment. The flour was safe for now, but the knowledge of the precariousness of my shelter, the constant threat of the elements, settled upon me like a heavy blanket. The night felt colder now, despite the warmth of the fire. I knew this was a temporary fix, a mere postponement of a more substantial repair. The coming dawn would bring new challenges, a new set of hurdles to overcome. But for now, the steady rhythm of the dripping had ceased. The quiet, broken only by the crackling fire, was almost welcome. The silence allowed me to feel the deep ache in my bones, the satisfying exhaustion that settled into my very core. I was tired, deeply, profoundly tired, but the simple act of securing my meager possessions offered a small victory in this strange, relentless struggle for survival.
The rhythmic rasp of the kern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was abruptly shattered. A sharp crack, like the snapping of a dry twig, echoed through the small roundhouse. It was followed by a silence, heavy and pregnant with foreboding, broken only by the frantic thump, thump, thump of my own heart. Then a slow, steady drip. Drip, drip, drip. My muscles, already screaming in protest after hours of relentless grinding, tensed. I slowly lowered the heavy kernstone, the familiar weight a comforting anchor in the sudden surge of anxiety. My gaze followed the sound, tracing the line of the dripping water until I located the source, a small, ragged tear in the thatch roof directly above the clay pot where I'd carefully stored my hard-earned flour. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at me. All that work, all that aching effort threatened by a simple leak. The precious flour, the creamy, fragrant reward for hours of back-breaking labor, was in danger. The thought was almost physically painful, a fresh weight added to my already exhausted frame. The drip, drip, drip continued, each drop a tiny hammer blow against my already frayed nerves. I had to act, and quickly, but the exhaustion weighed heavily on me, a leaden cloak stifling any immediate impulse to leap to action. My hands, raw and blistered, felt clumsy and useless. The air hung thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, mingling now with the sharp metallic tang of fear. Taking a deep breath, I carefully approached the leak, the rough texture of the packed earth floor cool beneath my bare feet. The firelight cast dancing shadows, making the tear in the thatch seem even larger, more menacing. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the brittle, decaying stalks. They crumbled at my touch, a fragile defense against the relentless advance of the night's rain. My mind raced, searching for a solution. There were no tools, no readily available materials, only the meager resources of the roundhouse. My gaze fell upon the discarded bundle of dried reeds near the fire. A slender hope sparked within me. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all I had. Gathering the reeds, I carefully worked them into the tear, attempting to weave them tightly enough to stanch the flow. My fingers ached, my muscles protested with every movement, but the urgency of the situation pushed me onward. The drip, drip, drip slowed, becoming a hesitant stutter, then a mere occasional trickle. Relief washed over me, a wave of exhaustion mixed with a fragile sense of accomplishment. The flour was safe for now, but the knowledge of the precariousness of my shelter, the constant threat of the elements settled upon me like a heavy blanket. The night felt colder now, despite the warmth of the fire. I knew this was a temporary fix, a mere postponement of a more substantial repair. The coming dawn would bring new challenges, a new set of hurdles to overcome. But for now, the steady rhythm of the dripping had ceased. The quiet, broken only by the crackling fire, was almost welcome. The silence allowed me to feel the deep ache in my bones, the satisfying exhaustion that settled into my very core. I was tired, deeply, profoundly tired, but the simple act of securing my meager possessions offered a small victory in this strange, relentless struggle for survival.
The rhythmic rasp of the quern, my constant companion for what felt like an eternity, was suddenly punctuated by another sound. It was a different scraping, lighter, more sporadic, and somehow more hopeful. It wasn't the harsh grind of stone on stone, but a gentler, almost musical scratching. Curiosity, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to indulge in for days, pricked at me. The aching muscles in my arms and back screamed their protest, but the insistent rhythm of that unfamiliar sound outweighed the pain. I carefully set aside the heavy quernstone, the flour-dusted surface cool against my blistered palms.
A sigh escaped my lips, a sound as rusty and creaking as the old wooden door of the roundhouse. The fire, my faithful sentinel, crackled contentedly, its warmth a balm to my chilled bones. Hesitantly, I rose, my joints protesting with a chorus of pops and groans. Each step felt heavy, weighted by the exhaustion that had settled deep into my very being. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the familiar smells of my enforced confinement. But now, layered over these, was a new fragrance, something subtly sweet and earthy, like freshly turned soil. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows that flickered and writhed around me, making the familiar space seem both menacing and comforting all at once. The roundhouse door was low and heavy, constructed of thick, interwoven branches plastered with mud and thatch. I pushed it open with a groan, the wood protesting against the sudden movement. Beyond, the night pressed in, black and vast, yet the unseen hand of the moon cast a faint, ethereal glow across the landscape. The scraping sound grew louder, guiding my steps. I followed the sound, my bare feet sinking slightly into the yielding earth. The ground was uneven, a mix of packed earth and loose stones. I had to move carefully. The sound led me to a small, low structure, almost hidden behind a tangle of bushes. It looked like a smaller version of the roundhouse, though less substantial, the thatch roof showing signs of age and disrepair. Cautiously, I peered inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. The air here smelled of wood shavings and something else, resin perhaps. And there, in the center of the small space, sat a figure hunched over a wooden frame, meticulously carving with a sharp tool. The rhythmic scraping I had heard was the sound of wood yielding to the craftsman's skillful hand. He didn't look up as I approached. His head was bent low, his attention completely absorbed by his work. The lamplight glinted on the smooth, curving surface of the wood he was shaping. It was beautiful, even from this distance, a delicate piece crafted with obvious skill and care. The quiet intensity of his concentration filled the tiny space, a silent conversation between man and material. For a moment, the weight of my own labors, the endless grind of the quern, seemed to lessen, replaced by a shared understanding of creation and tireless effort. I stood there for a while, just watching, feeling a sense of peace descend over me that I hadn't felt since my arrival. The rhythmic scraping of the tool became a lullaby, soothing my aching muscles and weary soul. This shared quiet, this unspoken communion with the craftsman and his creation, brought a quiet joy to the night, a feeling of shared humanity in this unexpected past. The rhythmic grinding of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, faltered. A sharp, searing pain lanced through my side, a sudden, unexpected interruption to the monotonous rhythm. I gasped, the breath catching in my throat, and the handle of the quern slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a jarring sound. For a moment the world tilted, and I leaned heavily against the wooden frame of the quern, my body trembling. The pain was sharp, insistent, a throbbing reminder of the relentless physical toll this task had taken. Until now, the aches and pains had been a dull background hum, easily ignored beneath the relentless focus required to maintain the steady rhythm of the grinding stones. But this was different. This was a sharp, stabbing reminder of my own vulnerability. I carefully placed my hand against my side, feeling the taut muscles beneath my rough-spun tunic.
There was no obvious wound, no bleeding, but the pain was undeniable, spreading outwards like a dark stain. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of my composure. Doubt, like a creeping vine, began to twist around my heart. Could I continue? Would I even be able to finish? The weight of the unfinished flower, the expectation of the elders, pressed down on me, heavier than the quern itself. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the roundhouse, mirroring the turmoil in my own mind. The comforting rhythm of the crackling flames now seemed a cruel mockery of my own failing strength. The familiar smells of wood smoke and grain suddenly felt oppressive, suffocating. My breath hitched, and the world seemed to shrink, confining me within the small circle of my own fear. Memories, half-formed and blurry, flickered through my mind. Memories of simpler times, before this strange and arduous existence, before the relentless grind of the quern. A fleeting image of a warm, sun-drenched meadow, the laughter of children. These memories, once fading whispers, now felt like shards of glass, sharp and painful, cutting through the fog of exhaustion. I sat there for a long time, the pain a constant companion, the weight of my doubt a heavy cloak. The fire continued to burn, its steady rhythm a contrast to the chaos within me. Slowly, gradually, the sharp edges of panic began to dull. I took a deep, shaky breath, and the comforting weight of the quern's heavy frame offered an unexpected comfort. The rhythmic turning of the quern, even in this condition, had become a rhythm of life, even a rhythm of life against the growing threat of this pain. Perhaps I could still finish. Perhaps with a slower pace, with more rest. But finish I must. This was my task, and I would complete it. Slowly, with painful deliberation, I adjusted my posture, finding a position that eased the pressure on my side. The pain remained, but the icy grip of fear loosened its hold. This injury, this pain, was a fact, a reality, but it was not an ending. It was merely another challenge to overcome. The task was vast, but it seemed not insurmountable. With a sigh, I reached for the handle of the quern once more, my hand trembling slightly. The rhythmic grinding began again, slower now, more deliberate, each turn a testament to my quiet determination to face this new pain, and to carry on. The rhythmic grinding of the stone seemed to echo the rhythmic beat of my own resolute heart. The rhythmic rasp of the quern stones, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was suddenly punctuated by a sharp intake of breath. A gust of wind, fierce and unexpected, slammed against the roundhouse, rattling the thatch roof above me like a skeleton shaking its bones. Then, silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. The comforting crackle of the fire, my constant companion throughout this endless task, was gone, extinguished as quickly as it had been lit. Darkness descended, absolute and complete. The warmth that had been a shield against the chill of the night vanished, replaced by a bone-deep cold that seeped into my very marrow. My hands, already raw and blistered from hours of grinding, felt numb. The familiar weight of the quern, now a source of unfamiliar fear in the oppressive blackness. The only sounds were the frantic beating of my heart and the whisper of the wind weaving its way through the cracks in the roundhouse walls. Panic, a cold serpent, coiled in my gut. I reached out, blindly, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the quern. It offered no comfort. The comforting rhythm, the familiar weight, felt alien and threatening in the sudden absence of the fire's light. I fumbled for my worn wool cloak, pulling it tighter around my shoulders, but the thin fabric offered little protection against the unrelenting cold. My thoughts raced, a frantic flurry in the darkness. How long could I last without the fire's warmth? How much longer could I endure the relentless grind of the quern? The rhythmic motion, once a source of meditative calm, now felt like a torment, the repetitive movement highlighting the vast emptiness of my surroundings. Remembering the embers, still faintly glowing beneath the ash, I searched frantically, scraping the cool ash aside with trembling hands. A few embers, red and stubbornly alive, remained. Gently, painstakingly, I coaxed them back to life, carefully fanning them with my cloak, using my breath to stoke the dying flames. It was a slow, agonizing process, but eventually a tiny spark caught, then another, until a fragile flame flickered back to life. The small fire offered little warmth, but it was enough to chase away the immediate threat of the cold, enough to illuminate the small space, allowing me to see the familiar contours of the quern once more. It was enough to bring a glimmer of hope, a small flame in the vast darkness of my fear. With renewed determination, though my hands still trembled, I resumed the rhythmic grind of the quern, the comforting repetition a bulwark against the chilling silence of the night. The weight of the stones was still there, the ache in my muscles still real, but the darkness was receding, replaced gradually by a stubborn, hard-won light. His voice. The rhythmic creak of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was punctuated by something new. A faint, sweet scent, delicate as a whispered secret, drifted on the air. Wild berries. The aroma, sharp and tangy, yet subtly sweet, unfurled a memory as unexpected as a sunbeam in a storm. I was a child again, small and nimble, scrambling through the undergrowth with a wicker basket slung over my shoulder. The sun warmed my face, dappled light filtering through the leaves. Laughter echoed in my ears, the sound of carefree joy. My companions, their faces blurred by time, yet their delight vividly remembered, urged me onwards, deeper into the woods. The thrill of the hunt, the anticipation of discovery, the simple pleasure of finding plump, ripe berries, it all flooded back, washing over me in a wave of bittersweet nostalgia. The memory faded, replaced by the heavy reality of the quern. But the urge remained, the need, almost desperate, to step outside this monotonous rhythm, to break the relentless cycle of grind and ache. It wasn't just about the berries themselves. It was about the memory they evoked, the lightness they promised. A small rebellion against the heavy weight of my task. A moment of self-care, however fleeting, in this relentless world. Hesitantly, I stopped the quern. The silence that followed was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the comforting drone I'd grown accustomed to. My hands, rough and blistered, ached with a dull, throbbing pain, but I ignored them, driven by a compulsion I couldn't quite explain. The fire's glow illuminated my face, reflecting in my weary eyes. I felt a pang of guilt, a sense of dereliction for pausing, for even considering this brief respite. With a deep breath, I carefully placed the quern's handle down, its weight surprisingly heavy after the prolonged use. Stepping out of the roundhouse, the night air felt cool against my skin, a welcome change from the stuffy warmth inside. The darkness was not complete. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast enough light to guide my steps. The scent of berries grew stronger, leading me towards a patch of bushes heavy with ripening fruit. Their dark, plump bodies glistened in the moonlight, inviting me closer. I knelt, carefully plucking the berries, their juicy flesh cool against my fingers. Each berry was a small victory, a tiny rebellion against the relentless grind. The taste, bursting with sweetness and tartness, was a revelation, a sensory explosion in the muted world of the roundhouse. The time spent gathering felt stolen, precious. I filled a small pouch with the berries, their weight a comforting reminder of this brief escape. The scent, clinging to my clothes and hair, promised a continuation of this stolen joy. Back in the roundhouse, the fire crackled contentedly, its comforting warmth a welcome counterpart to the night's chill. I resumed my work, the rhythm of the quern now infused with the sweet memory of wild berries, the taste lingering on my tongue, a small act of defiance against the unending task. The berries, a tiny taste of freedom, had given my weary soul a much-needed lift.
Rasp of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was abruptly broken. A silence descended, heavier than the usual pauses between breaths, a silence pregnant with something unseen, something unknown. Then the sound, footsteps. Not the light, shuffling steps of someone moving quietly within the settlement, but heavy, deliberate treads, each one echoing with a strange finality against the packed earth outside. They approached slowly, methodically, the sound growing closer with each passing moment. My hands, already raw and blistered, instinctively tightened on the quern's handles. The familiar weight of the stone, usually a comfort, now felt like a burden, a physical manifestation of my apprehension. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness of the roundhouse. The fire, my only companion for these long, lonely hours, crackled and pucked, casting flickering shadows that danced and writhed on the walls, mimicking the fear that coiled in my stomach. I strained my ears, trying to discern more from the approaching footsteps. Were they alone? How many were there? The possibilities spun in my mind, each more frightening than the last. Were they coming for me? Had I somehow failed in my task? Was the flower insufficient? Or was this some other kind of judgment? My mind raced, conjuring up images of stern faces, accusing eyes, and harsh words I couldn't understand. The footsteps paused. A beat of silence, thick and suffocating, stretched out, longer than the previous ones, and my breath hitched in my throat. I held my breath, listening intently, the only sound the frantic thump, thump, thump of my own pulse. Was this a test? A deliberate attempt to intimidate me? Or was it simply the uncertainty of the dark? It was a deliberate silence, and I could almost feel the weight of the unseen eyes on the other side of the thick, woven walls. Then a low murmur, barely audible above the whisper of the wind, reached my ears. It was a voice, deep and resonant, carrying an undercurrent of something. I couldn't quite place it. Was it concern, or was it something else entirely? The words were unintelligible, but the tone held a hint of something akin to reassurance. The heavy footsteps resumed, but now they seemed less menacing, their rhythm softer, more hesitant. They circled the roundhouse, pausing again before fading into the distance. A wave of relief washed over me, so intense it almost knocked me off my feet. I leaned heavily on the quern, my muscles screaming in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps.
The remaining flower, a pale mound in the clay pot, seemed less like a symbol of my achievement and more like a testament to my perseverance. I had survived the night. I had survived the silence, the approaching footsteps, and the uncertainty of my situation. For now, at least, I was safe. The fire crackled and settled into a more gentle rhythm. Its warmth was a comforting blanket in the deepening quiet. The rhythmic grind of the quern began anew, but now it was overlaid with a newfound sense of cautious hope.
The rhythmic rasp of the quern, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, was abruptly broken. A silence descended, heavier than the usual pauses between breaths, a silence pregnant with something unseen, something unknown. Then the sound, footsteps. Not the light shuffling steps of someone moving quietly within the settlement, but heavy, deliberate treads, each one echoing with a strange finality against the packed earth outside. They approached slowly, methodically, the sound growing closer with each passing moment. My hands, already raw and blistered, instinctively tightened on the quern's handles. The familiar weight of the stone, usually a comfort, now felt like a burden, a physical manifestation of my apprehension. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness of the roundhouse. The fire, my only companion for these long, lonely hours, crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows that danced and writhed on the walls, mimicking the fear that coiled in my stomach. I strained my ears, trying to discern more from the approaching footsteps. Were they alone? How many were there? The possibilities spun in my mind, each more frightening than the last. Were they coming for me? Had I somehow failed in my task? Was the flower insufficient? Or was this some other kind of judgment? My mind raced, conjuring up images of stern faces, accusing eyes, and harsh words I couldn't understand. The footsteps paused. A beat of silence, thick and suffocating, stretched out, longer than the previous ones, and my breath hitched in my throat. I held my breath, listening intently, the only sound the frantic thump, thump, thump of my own pulse. Was this a test? A deliberate attempt to intimidate me? Or was it simply the uncertainty of the dark? It was a deliberate silence, and I could almost feel the weight of the unseen eyes on the other side of the thick woven walls. Then a low murmur, barely audible above the whisper of the wind, reached my ears. It was a voice, deep and resonant, carrying an undercurrent of something. I couldn't quite place it. Was it concern, or was it something else entirely? The words were unintelligible, but the tone held a hint of something akin to reassurance. The heavy footsteps resumed, but now they seemed less menacing, their rhythm softer, more hesitant. They circled the roundhouse, pausing again, before fading into the distance. A wave of relief washed over me, so intense it almost knocked me off my feet. I leaned heavily on the quern, my muscles screaming in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The remaining flower, a pale mound in the clay pot, seemed less like a symbol of my achievement and more like a testament to my perseverance. I had survived the night. I had survived the silence,
the approaching footsteps, and the uncertainty of my situation. For now, at least, was safe. The fire crackled and settled into a more gentle rhythm. Its warmth was a comforting blanket in the deepening quiet. The rhythmic grind of the quern began anew, but now it was overlaid with a newfound sense of cautious hope.
The whistle, sharp and clear against the night's quiet, had faded, but the flickering light remained, a persistent ember in the vast darkness beyond the settlement. Curiosity, a flickering flame itself within my weary heart, pushed back against the exhaustion that clung to me like the dust from the quern. I crept to the edge of the roundhouse, the rough-hewn wood cool against my skin. Peering through a crack between the wattle and daub, I saw it more clearly now. It wasn't a fire built for warmth or cooking. It was small, contained, almost ritualistic. Nestled in a small clearing amidst the trees, it cast a fragile, dancing light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then I saw the figure. Silhouetted against the flames, the person was alone. They sat cross-legged, their form hunched slightly, tending to the fire with a slow, deliberate grace. There was something calming about their movements, a meditative stillness that contrasted sharply with the frantic rhythm of my life within the roundhouse. For a long moment, I simply watched, the strangeness of the situation washing over me. This was not the bustling sleeping village I'd glimpsed earlier. This was solitude, raw and untamed. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a fragrance utterly different from the wood smoke and grain that had filled my senses for so long. The sounds of the settlement, the distant snuffling of animals, the occasional rustle of leaves, were muted, replaced by the crackle of the distant fire and the soft whisper of the night wind through the trees. My own breathing was the most prominent sound, a heavy, labored rhythm against the stillness. Then the figure stirred. They looked up, and for a breathless instant our eyes met across the intervening space. Fear, sharp and sudden, pricked at me, a tiny, frantic bird fluttering in my chest. But there was no malice in their gaze, only a quiet understanding, a peaceful acceptance. Slowly, deliberately, they extended a hand, a gesture both simple and profound. The hand, slender and pale in the firelight, remained outstretched, a silent invitation. Hesitantly, I considered the implications. Could I trust this stranger? The unknown held both danger and possibility. The familiar, grinding rhythm of my task had become a comforting prison. Could I step outside the circle of my labor, however small it was, and enter into something beyond my comprehension? The decision wasn't a conscious choice, but a slow, steady unfurling, a loosening of the grip of fear. The sight of the outstretched hand against the backdrop of the distant fire was more compelling than the weight of my apprehension. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the heavy wooden door open with a quiet creak. The night air, crisp and cool, was a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth of the roundhouse. I stepped out into the clearing. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth. The silence was broken only by my heart, pounding a hesitant rhythm against my ribs. As I walked towards the figure, the smell of wood smoke and pine filled my lungs. It was different, softer, gentler than the smell of the roundhouse fire. It was a smell of peace. A sudden sharp pain shot through my knee, a searing, familiar agony that sent a jolt of surprise through my weary body.
It stopped me dead in my tracks, the rhythmic crunching of gravel underfoot replaced by a throbbing silence. I stumbled, my hand instinctively reaching out to steady myself against the rough bark of a nearby tree. The pain, a dull, insistent throb, was a visceral reminder of a forgotten injury, a relic from a life that felt both incredibly distant and unnervingly close. It had been a storm, a vicious tempest that had thrown our ship about like a child's toy. The waves, monstrous and unforgiving, had crashed over the deck, tossing sailors like rag dolls. I remember the icy spray stinging my face, the bone-jarring impact as I was thrown against the mast. The pain in my knee had been immediate, sharp, and agonizing, but the urgency of the situation, the fight for survival, had muted it, pushed it to the back of my mind. Now, in the quiet of this night, under a sky thick with stars, it returned with a vengeance. I sank to the ground, the cold earth a stark contrast to the warmth I'd felt just moments before. The pain was intense, a throbbing pulse that spread up my leg, a wave of discomfort washing over me. Memories, vivid and sharp, flooded my mind. The creak of the ship's timbers, the shouts of the crew, the terrifying roar of the wind and waves, all of it came back with startling clarity. I saw the faces of my fellow sailors, their expressions etched with fear and determination, their bodies strained with effort. I saw the captain, his face grim but resolute, barking orders amidst the chaos. For a long time, I simply sat there, the pain a constant, unwelcome companion. It wasn't just the physical discomfort, it was the emotional weight of it all. The memory of the storm, the near miss with death, the sheer terror of the ordeal. It all pressed down on me, a heavy blanket of the past. I had left that life behind, or so I thought. This new existence, this strange world of grinding grain and flickering firelight, had seemed a refuge, a way to escape the relentless uncertainty of the sea. But now, with this throbbing pain in my knee, the sea felt closer than ever before. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the pain, to find a moment of peace. But the images refused to fade. The storm, the ship, my fellow sailors, they were all inextricably bound to this pain. They were a part of me, a part I couldn't simply ignore or forget. The pain wasn't merely physical. It was a reminder of my resilience, of my ability to survive. It was a testament to the strength I possessed, a strength that had brought me here. With a sigh, I carefully examined my knee, probing gently around the area of greatest pain. The swelling wasn't excessive, but there was a definite tenderness. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I needed to find some way to ease the pain. I stood up, my legs stiff and protesting, but determined to continue, however slowly, towards that distant light. The pain was a constant reminder of the past, but it was also a catalyst for a renewed resolve, a quiet acknowledgement of my own endurance. The journey would be longer now, more difficult, but I wouldn't let this setback deter me. The path ahead remained uncertain, but I would continue walking towards the unknown.
The crackling of the fire, small and contained compared to the one in the roundhouse, painted dancing shadows on the figure's face. It was older than I was, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind, but their eyes held a surprising gentleness. They offered me a bowl, thick and earthenware, steaming with a broth I'd never encountered. The aroma was unlike anything I'd ever smelled. A rich, earthy blend of herbs and something subtly sweet, a fragrance that seemed to soothe my tired muscles even before I took a sip.
Hesitantly, I accepted the bowl. The stew was hot, a welcome burn against my chilled skin. Each spoonful was a revelation. Tender chunks of meat I couldn't identify, mixed with root vegetables and something akin to barley. My hunger, a dull ache for hours, roared to life, and I ate quickly, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. As the warmth spread through me, a strange sense of calm settled over my shoulders. It wasn't just the food, it was the silence, broken only by the gentle crackle of the fire, the quiet companionship. The figure watched me eat, their expression unreadable. After a while they spoke, their voice a low, gravelly murmur that was somehow both comforting and ancient. "Far from home, are you?" The question startled me. How could they know? I hesitated, then nodded. The words caught in my throat, a lump of unshed tears and unspoken sorrow. "A long way," I finally managed, my voice raspy. They nodded, understanding in their eyes. The sea, it calls some to wander, but the earth, it claims us all in the end. I looked at them, really looked, and saw something in their gaze, a recognition of shared experience. It wasn't just about the physical journey, but something deeper, something about the relentless pull of fate, the way life could twist and turn, leaving you stranded in unexpected places. "I was a sailor," I said, the words tumbling out unexpectedly. I hadn't spoken of my past to anyone here. The memory of the salt spray, the creak of the ship, the endless horizon flooded back, bringing both a wave of nostalgia and a pang of grief for a life that felt a lifetime ago. The figure listened patiently, their eyes never leaving mine. They didn't offer judgments or sympathy, just a quiet acceptance. They spoke of their travels, of hardships endured, of places seen and lost to time. Their stories were simple, devoid of grand adventures, yet they were imbued with a deep connection to the land, to the seasons, to the rhythms of nature. We sat there for a long time, two figures bathed in the flickering firelight, sharing stories of our past lives, tales of distant lands and long journeys, until the bowl was empty and the last embers were dying down. A shared silence fell between us, a silence filled with a strange understanding, a quiet acceptance of our separate journeys, and a sense of shared peace under a cold, star-filled sky. The weight of the corn seemed lighter now, and somehow the way ahead seemed a little less daunting.
The steam from the stew had long since faded, leaving behind only the lingering scent of unfamiliar herbs and spices, a faint sweetness that clung to the air. The shared silence, heavy with the unspoken weight of our separate journeys, stretched between us, comfortable yet expectant. The crackling embers of the fire cast dancing shadows, painting the faces of the surrounding hills in hues of orange and deep purple as the last vestiges of the sun disappeared below the horizon. I felt the warmth of the fire on my skin, a pleasant contrast to the still lingering chill in the air, and a comfortable weight settling in my bones after hours of travel and a surprisingly hearty meal. My companions sat quietly, their gaze fixed on the dying flames, a gentle calmness radiating from them. I too found my thoughts drifting, lulled by the quietude and the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the nearby undergrowth. Then it began. A low thrum, barely perceptible at first, vibrated through the ground, a deep, resonant pulse that resonated in my chest. It grew steadily louder, a rhythmic beat that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself, slow and deliberate, powerful and ancient. The sound was hypnotic,
a primal rhythm that resonated with something deep within me, a forgotten echo from a time before words, before the complexities of human interaction. It was the beating of a drum, distant yet somehow intimate, a call that seemed to emanate from the heart of the settlement itself. The drum's beat pulsed against the silence, a steady counterpoint to the crickets chirping, a comfortable presence in the encroaching darkness. My companion turned their gaze towards the direction of the sound, their expression unreadable. I felt a pull towards it, a sense of invitation, of belonging. This wasn't simply sound, it was a summons, a silent invitation to participate in something larger than myself, something older than my memories, something undeniably human. The rhythmic pulse continued, its tempo unchanging, its message clear. It was a rhythm of life, of community, of shared purpose. It spoke of gathering, of celebration, maybe of storytelling around crackling fires, maybe of dance, maybe of the simple exchange of companionship, the sharing of burdens and joys. The possibilities unfolded within me like a blossoming flower, each petal a new hope. For the first time since my arrival, the profound loneliness that had clung to me like a shroud began to lift. The weight of the day, the weight of the journey, the weight of the grinding seemed to ease, replaced by a curious anticipation. This wasn't just a sound, it was a beacon, a gentle urging to step into the unknown, to embrace the unfamiliar, to find my place within the tapestry of life unfolding within the settlement. The drumbeat guided me. It was an invitation to forget my past, to leave the uncertainty of my arrival behind, and accept the beckoning rhythm of the community that awaited. Taking a deep breath, the scent of wood smoke and stew still clinging to my clothes, I rose to my feet, my companion nodding a silent acknowledgement, and together we started walking towards the heart of the settlement, drawn by the ancient, comforting beat of the drum.
The drum beat, once a distant echo, now vibrated through the earth, a steady pulse in my chest. It was louder, more insistent, urging me forward. The stranger, their face etched with lines that spoke of countless sunrises and sunsets, remained silent, watching the embers of the fire die down. A comfortable silence settled between us, a shared understanding of the journey we both seemed to be on. But then, carried on the wind, a new scent reached me, cutting through the lingering smell of wood smoke and roasted meat. It was pungent, earthy, yet with an underlying sweetness that was utterly unfamiliar. My nose twitched, instinctively trying to identify it. It wasn't unpleasant, not at all. Rather, it held a curious intrigue, drawing my attention as surely as the drumbeat pulled my feet. Then, a memory flickered, a half-remembered image from a distant past. A walled garden, bathed in sunlight. The scent of damp earth, rich and fertile, mingling with the delicate fragrance of herbs. Rows of neatly planted vegetables, their leaves shimmering green. My small hands reaching out to pluck a sprig of something fragrant and unknown. My grandmother's gentle hand guiding mine, teaching me the names of each plant, whispering tales of their healing properties. The taste, sharp and clean on my tongue, a vivid contrast to the smoky, heavy meals that had sustained me these past days. The craving hit me with the force of a physical blow, a yearning for something green, something crisp and alive, something real. My throat tightened, my stomach clenching. The rich, comforting stew had done little to quell the hunger, but this was different. This was a need far deeper than mere sustenance. This was a longing for a forgotten taste, a connection to a life that felt as distant as the stars. I looked at the stranger.
their eyes reflecting the dancing light of the dying embers. I couldn't explain the sudden intensity of the feeling, the urgent need that suddenly dominated my senses. It was as if my body, starved of something more than nourishment, was crying out for a taste of home, a taste of a life I thought I had left behind. The drumbeat pulsed faster now, urging me onward, a powerful rhythm that seemed to intertwine with the throbbing in my temples and the pull in my stomach. The scent, stronger now, led me towards the sound, a tangible promise woven into the very fabric of the air. The memory of the garden, of my grandmother's gentle touch, fueled a hesitant step forward, away from the dwindling fire and into the growing darkness, the earth vibrating under my feet with the steady rhythm of the drums. I had to follow it. I had to find whatever source lay behind this powerful and compelling aroma, driven by this unexpected, powerful craving, a whisper of hope in the heart of a deep, primal longing. I needed to find the green.
The rhythmic drumming grew louder, a pulse that vibrated not just in my ears, but in the very ground beneath my feet. It pulled me forward, a silent, insistent invitation. The scent, earthy and sweet, intensified, a promise of something unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, a blend of scents I couldn't quite place. Perhaps damp soil, perhaps some strange, unfamiliar herb, or maybe both intertwined in a way that felt both ancient and alive. The drumming led me to a clearing, a small space bathed in the soft glow of a large fire. It wasn't the contained warmth of the roundhouse fire. This fire crackled and roared, a wild, untamed heart beating in the center of the gathering. Around it, a circle of people moved, their bodies weaving a pattern as intricate and mesmerizing as the flames themselves. It was a dance unlike any I had ever seen. There were no rigid steps, no formal choreography. It was a fluid, spontaneous expression of movement, each person responding to the rhythm of the drum, their bodies flowing like water, their limbs reaching towards the heavens, then grounding themselves in the earth. Their faces were alight, not with the practiced smiles of a performance, but with a genuine, infectious joy. Their shouts were not screams nor cries, but rather excited bursts of sound that rose and fell with the rhythm of the drum, a chorus of voices blending with the crackling fire and the pounding beat. The air thrummed with energy, a tangible force that seemed to push against me, beckoning me to join their circle. My weariness, the deep ache in my bones, the exhaustion that had settled into my very soul seemed to lessen under the influence of their vibrant energy. For a moment, the grinding of the quern, the weight of the flour, the cold of the night, all of it receded into the background, replaced by a hesitant curiosity, a flicker of something akin to hope. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure, watching their movements, my breath catching in my throat. There was something profoundly primal about this dance, something that spoke to a part of me I hadn't known existed. It felt ancient, deeply connected to the land, to the rhythms of nature, to something far older than the life I had left behind. The dancers' garments were simple, rough-spun fabrics in earthy tones, yet their movements held a grace that belied their humble attire. Their arms and legs flowed seamlessly, their expressions shifting from moments of pure exhilaration to others of quiet contemplation. It wasn't just a physical dance, it was a dance of spirit, a celebration of life itself. Doubt gnawed at the edges of my curiosity. I was an outsider, a stranger in this strange land. Would they welcome me?
Would I even be able to participate? The thought of joining them filled me with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, a feeling both exhilarating and terrifying. The drumbeat pulsed, an invitation, a challenge, a promise. I took a step closer, drawn by an irresistible force, the drumming a heartbeat in the night, a lullaby to the weary soul, and the rhythmic swirl of the dancers a vision of belonging in this unexpected ancient world. The firelight flickered, illuminating their faces, and for a moment I saw a reflection of my own weary but awakening spirit in their joyful expressions.
The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of the dancers. Their movements were fluid, hypnotic, a swirling tapestry of limbs and laughter. The air thrummed with the beat of the drum, a deep, resonant pulse that vibrated in my chest. For a long moment, I stood on the edge, a silent observer, the weight of the quern and the lonely hours still clinging to me like a damp shroud. But the music, the energy radiating from the circle, was a powerful draw. It whispered promises of release, of forgetting, even just for a little while. Hesitantly, I took a step forward. The earth beneath my feet felt solid, grounding, a welcome contrast to the disorientation of the past days. Another step, and then another. The music seemed to reach out, enfolding me, guiding my feet. I didn't know the steps, didn't understand the rhythm, but somehow my body knew what to do. My stiff muscles, protesting at first, began to loosen, to yield to the pulse of the drum. The strange, earthy scent that had drawn me here filled my nostrils, a heady mix of something unfamiliar and yet strangely comforting. It was like a forgotten memory, a whisper of a scent from a distant, half-remembered past. The dancers, their faces lit by the firelight, were smiling. Their eyes shone with a light that was both ancient and joyful, a testament to a life lived close to the earth, to the rhythms of nature. They didn't seem to notice my awkwardness, my hesitant steps. They simply welcomed me into their circle, their movements weaving around mine, their laughter echoing in the night. It was a silent communication, a shared understanding that transcended words. It was a language of the body, of the soul, a language older than the quern itself. With each beat of the drum, the weight of my past seemed to lift a little more. The exhaustion from the grinding, the fear of the unknown, the haunting memories of a life left behind, all of it faded into the background, replaced by the raw, exhilarating joy of movement, of shared energy. This wasn't just a dance. It was a ritual, a celebration of life, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a way of letting go, of surrendering to the moment, of finding solace in the shared experience of a community. The firelight danced, reflecting in the eyes of the dancers, transforming them into ephemeral figures, half human, half mythical. The rhythmic movements of their bodies seemed to mirror the rhythm of the land itself, the ebb and flow of the seasons, the rise and fall of the tides. And in that shared dance, in the pulsing beat of the drum, I found a sense of belonging I hadn't known I craved. It was a fragile hope, a flickering flame in the darkness, but it was a hope nonetheless, a testament to the power of human connection, the restorative magic of shared joy. The dance went on, and with each passing moment, I felt myself sinking deeper into its embrace, into the heart of this ancient community.
The uncertainties of my future still lingered, but they no longer felt as daunting, as inescapable. Here, in this circle of firelight and music, I found a momentary sanctuary, a place of acceptance, a place where I could simply be. And for the first time since I had arrived, I allowed myself to hope, to dream, to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, I might find a place for myself in this strange, ancient world.
The faces around them, initially blurred and indistinct in the flickering firelight, slowly resolved into individual features. Lined faces etched with the stories of countless seasons, youthful eyes bright with an energy that belied their weariness. They weren't smiling, not exactly, but their expressions held a quiet intensity, a shared understanding that transcended words. It was a language of movement, of rhythm, of shared experience. The drum's beat pulsed in their chests, a steady, comforting rhythm echoing the ancient pulse of the earth itself. As the dance continued, the narrator felt a strange lightness, a shedding of the weight that had burdened them for so long. The weight of the quern, the weight of uncertainty, the weight of their solitary struggle. The past, with its memories of a different life, a life lived across the sea, faded into a gentle background hum. No longer a sharp contrast to their present reality, but a part of the tapestry that made them who they were. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that played across the faces of their newfound companions. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthiness of the soil, creating a heady, almost intoxicating aroma. The air, crisp and cool, carried the faintest hint of rain on the distant horizon. Yet there was no fear in the approaching storm, only a quiet anticipation, a shared understanding that even the fiercest tempest would pass. The dance slowed, the drum beat gradually fading until only the soft whispers of the wind remained. The firelight cast long shadows, blurring the edges of the clearing, drawing a veil around them. As the narrator stood, still breathless from the exertion, a hand rested lightly on their shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity or sympathy, but one of acknowledgement, of welcome. There were no words exchanged, none needed. The shared experience, the unspoken understanding was enough. Looking up at the star-studded sky, the narrator felt a profound sense of peace. The future remained unwritten, a vast, uncharted territory. Yet, for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't feel terrifying. It felt possible, full of possibility. And that, they realized, was enough. A new day dawned, not with the rising sun, but with the rising hope in their heart. The rhythmic grinding of the quern was replaced by the gentle rhythm of their breathing, a new rhythm of life, found not in isolation, but in the shared heartbeat of a community. The journey had been long and arduous, but they had arrived. They had found their home.